And now that we had a look at a couple of concepts that are related to writing good tests, I think it's good to come back to app.js. We haven't written any tests for that file yet, and that file only has one function and then some code where we select DOM elements and add an event listener that aren't inside of any function. We could put them into a function, but for the moment we'll just ignore that code because we're interacting with the DOM here, and that is something we'll come back to later in the course. But inside of this huge function, we're doing many things, and we might want to kind of split that up, and testing all these things in one test could become tricky. Because of course, when we test form submit handler, even if we just want to test one behavior, we will always execute all the code that's in this function. So if our test fails thereafter, even though we're just testing one behavior, it could fail because any part of that overall code failed. So still finding out why our test failed could be challenging or tricky. Hence, what you should try to do to make your life easier for testing, but also to improve the readability of this overall function here, is you should try to split it up into multiple functions. And that is also something I talk about in my Clean Code course, and I do recommend there that you should also try to avoid complex functions like this. Instead, you might just want to call a bunch of other functions in that function, and those other functions do the individual tasks that need to be done, like getting the input, validating the input, and so on. And if you do that, you have the benefit that this function will get a bit more readable and maintainable, and your tests will become more manageable as well, and you will be able to have more granular tests. So testing kind of forces you to write better application code, which is a huge benefit of adding tests to your project, that you are forced to write cleaner code. Again, that is also something I do talk about in that other course. So therefore here, to make testing easier and as a side effect improve our code here in app.js, I will now split up this form submit handler function again into multiple other functions. Of course, this is not something you have to do, but it's something I recommend, and I will definitely do it here because, of course, I want to teach you good practices in this course. So how can we split up this function? Well, as always, there will be different ways of doing it, but if we look at the code in this function, there are actually a couple of different steps that we're performing. The first step is that we're preventing the default, and I will keep that in this function here. It's just one line of code. Outsourcing it into a separate function wouldn't really save us any code here, and I don't see a huge benefit of outsourcing this, so we'll keep it here. Now, the next thing we're doing is in the end that we are getting our input, so the input provided by the user in the form, and we are then validating that input. So that's either one or two steps, depending on how you look at that. So we are getting the input, and then we are validating and transforming the input. Once we did that, we are calculating the result. That's the next thing we do. We are deriving a result depending on whether the validation we executed here failed or if it succeeded. So calculating the result is the next step after getting and transforming and validating the input. And then we also derive the output text that we want to output. So that's the next thing we're doing. We're getting the output text which is based on the result we calculated. And last but not least, we output our output text in the DOM. This is again just one line of code which we could keep here, but it could theoretically become more complex, so I do want to outsource this into a separate function as well. So the functions, the separate functions I want to create here are separate functions for getting my user input, for then cleaning that input, so for validating and transforming it, for deriving my result, for deriving the result text, and for outputting the result text. Now, definitely feel free, as a practice, to do this on your own first. Simply add a bunch of new functions, outsource the code, refactor the code, and add those functions you outsourced into files that make sense to you, for example, into parser.js and so on. In the next lecture, we will go through this transformation together.